The moment a queen became property, the crowd did not scream. That was the first thing she noticed. Thousands of Romans stood packed along the stone road, shoulder to shoulder, close enough that she could see the whites of their eyes. Yet no one shouted her name. No one cursed her. No one demanded her death. They watched in silence, and that silence was worse than any roar. The chain around her wrists was heavy, not because it needed to restrain her, but because it needed to be seen. Gold links pressed into her skin, cold despite the sun, pulling her arms slightly forward, so her posture was never fully upright. Every step reminded her that balance itself was no longer hers to control. She had ruled cities. She had commanded soldiers. Now her pace was decided by men who would not look at her face. Roman guards walked beside her, not tense, not alert, but bored, as if escorting livestock. That was when the truth began to settle in her chest. This was not punishment yet. This was preparation. Only days earlier, she had been a queen in the eyes of her people. Her banners still flew when the final battle broke. She had followed Roman treaties before defying them. She had sent envoys, paid tributes, spoken their language of law and order. None of it mattered now. The moment her army collapsed, something invisible snapped into place. Under Roman rules, defeat did not mean arrest. It meant erasure. Roman writers called it ius gentium, the law of nations, a phrase that sounded civilized until it was applied. Any enemy captured in war became property. Not a criminal, not a prisoner with rights. A thing owned by the Roman state. Titles dissolved instantly. Queen, mother, ruler, these were sounds with no legal meaning anymore. She was not told this formally. No official announcement marked the moment her identity vanished. It happened quietly, efficiently, the way Rome preferred its cruelty. She was moved from tent to room, from room to ship, from ship to holding chamber. Guards changed. Orders were passed above her head. No one explained what would happen next. That uncertainty was intentional. Rome understood something simple. Fear grows best when fed slowly. If they had announced execution, the waiting would have ended. If they had promised mercy, resistance might survive. Instead, they gave her nothing. Days blurred together. Sleep came in fragments. Food arrived without pattern. She was not beaten. She was not comforted. She was held in a state between life and death, where imagination did the work that chains could not. Rumors reached her anyway. Whispers from other captives, half-remembered stories carried across generations. Some defeated rulers vanished before Rome ever saw them. Others were displayed and then removed at the final moment, dragged away beneath the Capitoline Hill where sunlight never reached. A few survived, stripped of power, forced to live as reminders of what resistance cost. She did not know which fate awaited her. That was the point. Rome was deciding not whether she deserved to live, but whether her body would be more useful alive. When the order finally came, it did not say execution. It said preparation. The Senate had approved a triumph. That single word changed everything. A Roman triumph was not a parade. It was a ritual designed to teach the empire how to remember victory. And at the center of that ritual stood the defeated. Kings, generals, queens, alive, visible, humiliated. As the weight of the gold chain dragged her shoulders down, she understood something terrifying. Rome did not want her silence. It wanted her seen. And once Rome decided that, the suffering was only beginning. Why Rome preferred queens alive, she learned the truth before anyone spoke it aloud. In Rome, death was simple. Too simple. A clean execution ended fear too quickly, turned enemies into martyrs, and allowed stories of bravery to survive. Rome did not want bravery remembered. Rome wanted obedience learned. That was why the guards never threatened her. That was why no sentence was announced. That was why she was still breathing. The most dangerous moment was not the battlefield where she had nearly died, but this quiet space where Rome had decided she was more valuable alive. When an empire keeps you alive without telling you why, it is because your body has become a message. Roman commanders understood psychology long before the word existed. They knew that a dead queen could inspire songs, legends, and revenge. But a living queen, stripped of authority and dragged through the streets, did something far more effective. She taught fear. Rome's wars were not only fought with swords and shields. They were fought with images burned into memory. A defeated ruler, still recognizable, still human, yet powerless, was proof that resistance led not to glory, but to humiliation. This was why Rome invested so much effort in captives like her. She was not being spared. She was being converted into propaganda. In Roman thinking, power was sacred. To possess it was divine favor. To lose it publicly meant the gods themselves had turned away. When queens were captured alive, Rome made sure they were not erased. Their clothing remained rich. Their jewelry stayed visible. Their faces were uncovered. The goal was not to hide who they had been, but to force the world to watch what they had become. A ruler reduced to spectacle was more terrifying than any battlefield massacre. Cities surrendered faster when they remembered the last queen who had walked Rome in chains. This logic was not accidental. Roman triumphs followed a pattern refined over centuries. First came delay. Captives were held in silence, denied information, allowed to imagine every possible ending. Then came survival. Rumors were allowed to spread that execution might not happen at all. Hope was permitted, briefly, because hope made the fall sharper. Finally came exposure. When the triumph was announced, the captive understood that their suffering was no longer private. It would be shared with the empire. Rome believed fear multiplied when witnessed. There was another reason Rome preferred queens alive, one rarely written down. Female rulers carried symbolic weight that male kings did not. They were mothers, lineage holders, living embodiments of future generations. To dominate them publicly was to send a warning not just to armies, but to families, tribes, and bloodlines. Rome knew that when a queen was broken, her people felt unprotected. Loyalty fractured. Resistance weakened. The empire did not need to occupy every village if fear reached there first. While she waited, confined and watched, officials debated her fate without her presence. Not whether she was guilty, but how effective she could be. Would she walk the full route? Would she survive the procession? Would the crowd see strength or collapse? Every detail mattered. Her endurance would determine the lesson Rome delivered. She understood now that survival did not mean safety. It meant continued use. Rome had chosen her not as a prisoner, but as a tool, and tools, once used, were often discarded. As preparations continued across the city, she felt the walls closing in not physically, but historically. She was being positioned inside a ritual older than she was, one designed to outlive her entirely. Rome did not ask if she consented. Rome did not need her agreement. It needed her presence. And once Rome decided that, there was no path left that did not lead forward, into the crowd, into memory, and toward a humiliation carefully engineered to echo far beyond her own life. The ritual of public humiliation. The sound reached her before the light did. Drums, horns, and metal striking metal echoed through stone corridors, growing louder with every step until the air itself seemed to vibrate. She could feel the crowd before she saw it, a living weight pressing in from both sides, waiting. The door ahead opened, and sunlight cut across her face, so sharply it forced her eyes closed for a heartbeat. When she stepped forward, the noise exploded. Not rage, not hatred, excitement. That realization struck harder than fear. Rome was not angry with her. Rome was entertained. The guards adjusted their grip, not to restrain her, but to set the pace. Slow, measured, every movement controlled. This was not a march. It was choreography. Roman triumphs followed strict rules, and humiliation was written into every one of them. Nothing was left to chance. The order of the procession mattered. Painted panels of burning cities came first, showing what resistance led to. Exotic animals followed, dragged from distant lands, proof that the world itself bent to Roman will. Only then came the prisoners. Soldiers in chains walked with heads lowered, already erased. But at the front of the captives were the rulers, kings, princes, queens, alive, recognizable. Rome wanted the crowd to see power fall with its face uncovered. Her clothing had been chosen deliberately. Not rags, not prison garb. Rich fabric, clean lines, colors that marked her status. Rome did not want confusion. They wanted clarity. This is who she was. This is what Rome did to her. The gold chain pulled at her wrists, heavy enough to tire her arms before the road tired her legs. It caught the sun and flashed with every step, forcing eyes toward it. She understood then that the chain was not about restraint. It was about contrast. Gold once worn as jewelry was now used as a leash. The route stretched endlessly ahead, nearly 4 kilometers through the heart of the city, through spaces designed to amplify memory. Balconies filled with spectators. Children lifted onto shoulders. Vendors shouting over the noise. People laughed, pointed, commented on her posture, her expression, her composure. Every stumble drew attention. Every moment of strength disappointed those hoping to see her break. Rome allowed the crowd to participate because humiliation worked best when shared. This was not private suffering. This was communal education. At intervals, the procession stopped. Not for rest, but for display. The guards would hold her in place, while officials announced victories, listed conquered cities, named defeated enemies. Her name was spoken last, deliberately, so it lingered. She was not allowed to speak. Silence was part of the ritual. A queen who once commanded with words was now reduced to presence alone. Rome believed silence stripped authority faster than violence ever could. What terrified her most was not the crowd, but the uncertainty at the end of the road. Not all captives finished the triumph. Some were diverted quietly before the final ascent to the Capitol hill. There, beneath the temple of Jupiter, prisoners could be led away, down into stone chambers where history ended without witnesses. She did not know if she would see the summit. She did not know if survival awaited her or disappearance. Every step carried that question forward. Rome understood this fear. The ritual was designed so that hope and dread walked side by side. If she endured, it proved Rome's mercy. If she vanished, it proved Rome's power. Either outcome served the empire. As the procession moved on and the crowd surged with it, one truth became clear. This humiliation was not meant to destroy her instantly. It was meant to stretch suffering across time, across memory, until entire nations learned the lesson without. Rome ever raising a sword again. What happened before the triumph, before Rome allowed the crowd to see her? It made sure she was already weakened. Not with chains or blows, but with waiting. The most terrifying moments were not spent walking through the streets, but standing alone in rooms where time felt suspended. Doors opened without explanation, closed without warning. Guards changed faces so often she could not learn their habits. Lamps burned late into the night, then vanished for hours, leaving her unsure whether dawn had come or passed. Rome understood something brutal. The mind breaks faster when it is denied certainty. Fear sharpens when it has no shape. These holding chambers are not prisons in the way enemies imagined. They were clean, quiet, almost respectful. That was intentional. Rome did not want visible suffering before the triumph. Bruises told the wrong story. A battered captive looked pitiful. Rome needed her intact, composed, recognizable. The damage had to be internal. Sleep was interrupted just often enough to dull her thoughts. Meals were inconsistent, never enough to starve, never enough to satisfy. No one spoke about her fate. Silence became the loudest instrument Rome used against her. Roman law made this treatment possible. Once captured, a defeated ruler existed outside legal protection. There was no charge to answer, no appeal to make. Roman citizens were shielded by procedure, by centuries of carefully guarded privilege. Foreign enemies had none of it. Rome did not consider this cruelty. It considered it order. Law was not universal. It was selective. And once someone fell beyond its boundary, anything done to them could be justified as necessity. During this time, officials debated her future without her presence, not in terms of guilt or innocence, but in terms of usefulness. Could she endure the procession without collapsing? Would she maintain composure or display weakness? Both outcomes had value. A queen who remained dignified suggested Rome's mercy. A queen who broke confirmed Rome's dominance. Either way, Rome won. This was not justice. It was calculation. Her life was weighed like an object, assessed for its impact on public memory. Preparation extended beyond her body. Rome prepared the audience as carefully as it prepared the captive. Stories were seeded throughout the city. Whispers about her arrogance, her defiance, her challenge to Roman order. By the time she would appear, the crowd would already know how to interpret what they saw. Rome understood that people rarely witness events neutrally. They watch through expectations shaped in advance. The triumph did not begin on the day of the procession. It began weeks earlier in conversation. She sensed this manipulation even in isolation. Guards avoided eye contact but listened carefully when she spoke, reporting tone rather than words. Rome did not fear what she said. It feared how she appeared. Strength unsettled them. Weakness reassured them. Every detail was noted. Every reaction became part of a larger design. She was no longer a person moving through time. She was a symbol being refined, and yet this preparation carried a risk Rome understood well. Humiliation did not always produce submission. Sometimes it produced memory. Sometimes it planted rage deep enough to survive defeat. Rome had seen this before. Queens, mothers, and rulers who endured public disgrace did not always vanish quietly. Some became sparks. Some returned as legends. As she waited in those silent rooms, the empire prepared to display her as proof of Roman supremacy. What Rome did not yet know was whether this ritual would end resistance or ignite something far more dangerous once the spectacle was complete, when mothers became warnings. The moment Rome feared most was not rebellion. It was remembrance. That was why the guards watched her so closely when children were mentioned, when lineage was discussed, when family names surfaced in whispers. Rome understood something chillingly well. Empires fall faster when mothers remember what was taken from them. In the silence before the triumph, this fear shaped every decision. The suspense was never about whether she would survive. It was about what would survive through her. Rome had learned through bitter experience that humiliation could either erase a people or bind them together in anger strong enough to burn cities. Across conquered lands, Roman policy followed a pattern rarely written into law but practiced with precision. Male rulers were defeated on battlefields. Female rulers were defeated in public. Queens were not only leaders, they were symbols of continuity, of bloodlines, of future resistance. To break them publicly was to send a warning that went beyond military power. It said, "Your children are not safe, your legacy is not sacred, your traditions will not protect you." Rome did not need to massacre entire populations when fear could do the work more efficiently. This is why Rome's harshest lessons often involved families. Not always through execution, not always through violence, but through exposure. Mothers were forced to witness their own degradation. Children were made to watch authority collapse. The goal was not immediate obedience, but long-term submission. A generation raised on fear was easier to govern than one raised on martyrdom. Roman historians rarely described these moments in detail. When they did, they used careful language, short phrases, passive constructions. Not because the events were insignificant, but because explaining them too clearly risked revealing how deliberate they were. She understood this instinctively. Every glance from the crowd was not just directed at her, but through her, toward her people. Rome was speaking to them through her body, her posture, her silence. This is what defiance earns. This is what protection looks like when Rome withdraws it. Even mercy, when granted, carried its own message. A spared queen was not a gift. She was a living reminder, sent back stripped of power, to be seen every day by those who once bowed before her. Rome's commanders debated these outcomes endlessly. Should she be returned to live quietly, watched and diminished? Should she disappear after the triumph, her fate left deliberately unclear? Ambiguity itself was a weapon. When people did not know what happened to their queen, fear filled the gap. Rome understood that uncertainty traveled faster than truth. Rumors spread more effectively than proclamations. A vanished ruler haunted the imagination longer than a dead one. Yet Rome's strategy carried a dangerous flaw. Mothers who survived humiliation did not always forget. Some carried memory like an ember, small but enduring. They passed it quietly, in stories told after dark, in warnings disguised as lessons. Rome believed public shame ended resistance. History suggests it often delayed it instead. The deeper the humiliation, the longer it lingered beneath the surface dot as preparations neared completion. Rome believed it had perfected its message. A queen would be displayed, dignity bent but not destroyed, fear delivered without chaos. What Rome did not account for was how pain transforms when it is shared across generations. The lesson meant to silence. A people sometimes taught them exactly where the empire was most vulnerable. And when that realization surfaced, Rome would learn that not all warnings fade. Some wait. The lesson Rome wanted the world to learn, the final silence, was the most dangerous one. After the procession ended, after the crowds dispersed, after the city returned to its routines, Rome expected the story to be finished. That was always the assumption. A triumph closed the chapter. Fear had been delivered. Memory had been shaped. The defeated were either absorbed, erased, or forgotten. But history rarely obeys the plans of empires. What Rome underestimated was what humiliation becomes once it outlives the moment it was designed for. The queen did not vanish from memory when the chains were removed. She lingered, in whispers, in songs that did not praise her, but remembered what Rome did to her. And those memories did not die quietly. Rome believed its rituals were permanent solutions. Public domination, legal erasure, symbolic destruction of identity, these were meant to be final acts. From Rome's perspective, the lesson was clear. Resist us, and you will be unmade. Not only killed, but stripped of meaning. Reduced to a warning. And for a time, it worked. Cities hesitated. Allies obeyed. Fear traveled faster than legions. The empire expanded not just through conquest, but through reputation. Rome did not need to be everywhere if its cruelty was remembered everywhere. Yet that same reputation carried a cost. The more Rome relied on spectacle, the more it revealed its own dependence on fear. An empire confident in loyalty does not need parades of broken rulers. It does not need to display queens in chains to prove strength. Rome did. And in doing so, it taught the world something unintended. It showed that its power was not divine or eternal, but maintained through carefully managed terror. Once people understood that, fear began to change shape. It became anger, then resolve. Rebellions did not always begin with armies. They began with memory, with mothers telling children why certain names were spoken softly, with leaders remembering how Rome treated those who trusted trees and law. Queens who survived humiliation became living contradictions to Roman messaging. They proved that endurance was possible. That shame did not always break a people. Sometimes it taught them patience. Rome's own historians hinted at this unease. They recorded triumphs proudly, but rebellions cautiously. When uprisings followed humiliation, the connection was left unexplained, as if coincidence could hide causation. In the end, Rome's lesson was learned, but not in the way it intended. The world learned that Rome ruled through law only when it was convenient. That citizenship was protection, but conquest was exposure. That mercy was conditional and humiliation was policy. These truths spread quietly, long after the drums stopped beating, long after the gold chains were melted down. Empires are remembered not only for what they built, but for what they were willing to do to maintain control. The queen's body had been used as a message, but messages evolve once they leave their sender. What Rome meant as a warning became a record of cruelty. What it intended as silence became testimony. And centuries later, when ruins replaced palaces and legions became dust, the testimony remained, not as triumph, not as glory, but as a reminder that power sustained by humiliation always plants the seeds of its own reckoning.